Imagine waking up one morning and realizing your entire street is slowly sinking into a swamp, not because of a storm, not because of a natural disaster, but because the very people who were supposed to protect your neighborhood simply didn't care. A small leak, ignored for days, turned into a disaster that could cost homeowners tens of thousands of dollars. And the worst part? The HOA. The same HOA that takes our money every single month refused to lift a finger. This is the story of how our community was abandoned, how one disabled homeowner was left to suffer, and how I decided to take matters into my own hands. When I first noticed the change, I didn't think much of it. The water pressure in my house had always been bad. Not terrible, just weak enough that taking a shower felt more like standing under a leaky faucet than an actual spray. But that morning, as I turned on the kitchen sink, the water dribbled out like a dying garden hose. That was different. Something was definitely wrong. I figured it was a city issue. That's how it usually goes in neighborhoods like mine. Pipes run deep beneath the roads, and every few years, some valve or line decides to give out. So I picked up the phone and called the city utilities department. A polite woman on the other end took down my details and promised they'd send someone out to check. I hung up feeling reassured, thinking that by the evening everything would be back to normal. But evening came and nothing had changed. The shower still barely trickled, the sink still sputtered, and no one from the city had shown up. I gave it another day. Maybe they were just backed up with work. But when the pressure dropped even more, I called again. This time the tone was different. The man on the phone barely let me finish my explanation before saying, "Oh, that's not on us. That's an HOA problem." I remember sitting there, phone pressed to my ear, stunned for a second. An HOA problem. Since when did the Homeowners Association have anything to do with underground water lines? But before I could argue, he repeated himself like he was reading it off a script. "Yeah, that's not our jurisdiction. You'll need to contact your HOA management company." So I did. I called the HOA management office, the same office that collects our dues every month, the same office that's supposed to represent the board that none of us ever actually see. The woman there listened to my complaint with the kind of distant politeness that tells you she's already thinking about something else. "We'll notify the board," she said flatly. No urgency, no reassurance, just a line I imagined she had repeated 100 times that week. Days went by. The pressure didn't return. In fact, it got worse. And then I saw it. About 12 houses down from mine, there was a puddle in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was rainwater, except we hadn't had any rain in days. I slowed my car as I drove past, staring at it, and noticed the faint ripples spreading outward. Water was bubbling up through the asphalt. That was the moment it clicked. The low pressure in my house, the city shrugging me off, the HOA management company brushing me aside, it was all connected. Somewhere under that road, a pipe was broken, and water was leaking non-stop. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Within days, neighbors began whispering about it. One guy across the street said his sprinklers barely ran anymore. Another woman told me her washing machine wasn't filling up. People were calling both the city and the HOA, and we were all getting the same runaround. "We'll notify the board." Always the board, the mysterious board. But the board never spoke to us. We didn't even know who the board members were. Privacy concerns, they said. It was like yelling into a void. By the end of the week, the puddle had grown. It wasn't just a wet patch anymore. It was a small pool, wide enough that cars had to swerve around it. The asphalt looked soft, like it was on the verge of caving in, and every time I drove past, I couldn't shake the thought, is this how sinkholes start? Was our street literally going to collapse before someone decided to do something? I felt angry, but more than that, I felt powerless. I was watching a problem grow right in front of me, And the people in charge couldn't be bothered to care. They had access to our money, thousands of dollars set aside for emergencies like this. But when the emergency actually came, they acted like it wasn't their problem. Every time I called the management company, it was the same robotic assurance. We'll notify the board. One evening, I finally snapped and asked, "Can I talk to someone from the board directly?" The answer was curt. "No, board members' information is private." That's when it really sank in. The very people who were supposed to protect our neighborhood had hidden themselves away. They had the power, they had the resources, but they were unreachable, untouchable. And meanwhile, water was pouring into the road, turning our street into a swamp. What started as a trickle in my kitchen sink had now grown into something much bigger, something that threatened the entire neighborhood. And the scariest part? No one in charge seemed to care. The puddle didn't stay a puddle for long. Within days, it spread wider and darker, soaking through the cracks in the asphalt until it resembled more of a shallow pond than a random wet spot. By the second week, you could see the water glistening under the streetlights at night, like the reflection of a lake that had no business being there. The air even smelled different, damp, earthy, as though our cul-de-sac had been transplanted into a marshland. At first, neighbors just grumbled in passing. People walking their dogs would shake their heads as they skirted the water, pulling their pets closer to the dry sidewalk. Joggers detoured around the block to avoid running through it. Delivery trucks swerved, their wheels splashing muddy streaks across the pavement. What had once been a minor inconvenience was quickly becoming a daily disruption, and the more it grew, the louder the complaints became. One afternoon, I overheard a small group of neighbors gathered at the end of the street. They were huddled, like conspirators, voices low but filled with frustration. "My basement pump's been running non-stop," one man muttered. "Water's seeping in somewhere." Another woman said her front yard looked like it had been overwatered, even though she'd turned her sprinklers off weeks ago. I joined them and shared what I'd learned about the city refusing to act, about the HOA management companies, endless promises to notify the board. Their reactions were exactly what I expected: disbelief, irritation, and the familiar helpless shrug that said, "What else can we do?" But the truth was, this wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It was a threat. Every time a car drove past, the ground looked weaker, softer, like the road itself was dissolving. I imagined the worst-case scenario: the asphalt collapsing into a massive sinkhole, swallowing up part of the street, maybe even dragging in a parked car or two. The cost of repairing something like that would be astronomical. Tens of thousands, maybe more. And who would pay for it? Us, the homeowners. I couldn't get that thought out of my head, that every day the management company delayed, every time they shrugged us off, the bill we'd all eventually receive was growing larger. What could have been a quick fix was turning into a catastrophe. So I called them again. I told them the puddle was expanding, that neighbors were worried about structural damage, that this was no longer just a maintenance issue, it was an emergency. And still, their response was the same cold script. "We'll notify the board," I pressed harder. "Can I speak to the board directly? Do they even know what's happening here?" The voice on the other end stiffened. "The board has been notified. That's all I can tell you." I hung up, seething. Notified? That word had become meaningless. It was just a way to shut us down, to pass the problem along without ever addressing. In the following Friday, a rumor spread that someone from management had come out to inspect. Nobody saw them, but apparently they had been here. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to think the wheels were finally in motion. For a brief moment, I even felt relief. Maybe they'd dig up the road, fix the line, and by Monday we'd all be laughing about how paranoid we'd been. But Monday came, and the puddle was worse than ever. It had doubled in size, creeping outward, pooling along the curb, and spilling onto the sidewalk. Kids on bikes now avoided our block altogether. Parents warned their children not to play near it, afraid of falling into what was now, unmistakably, a swamp. That's when the fear really set in. If this could happen, if a problem this obvious, this visible, could sit ignored for weeks, then what else could fall apart in our neighborhood? The roads, the sewer lines, the roofs over our heads. I realized it wasn't just about water anymore. It was about trust, or, more accurately, the lack of it. We had trusted this HOA, trusted the faceless board members we'd never met, trusted the management company to act on our behalf. And here we were, watching our street slowly drown, while the people in charge pretended nothing was happening. Late one night, I stood at my window staring down the block at the glow of the streetlights bouncing off that stagnant pool. I could hear the faint trickle of water underneath the road, a constant reminder of what was slipping away. My neighborhood, my investment, my home. And I knew, deep down, that if nothing changed, we were heading toward disaster. It was almost 2 weeks into this nightmare when the city finally showed up, not because the HOA called them, of course, they hadn't lifted a finger, but because so many of us neighbors had filed complaints that the city couldn't ignore it anymore. A white utility truck rolled down our street one morning, men in neon vests stepping out with clipboards and measuring equipment. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe someone was finally going to take this seriously. I stood with a few neighbors as the workers prodded at the puddle, lifted manhole covers, and pressed their ears against long metal poles to listen for running water underground. It was like watching detectives at a crime scene, and in a way, that's exactly what it was. A crime scene. The victim, our neighborhood. The culprit, neglect. After hours of poking and testing, one of the workers gathered us around. "We found the source," he said, pointing down the block. "It's not the main city line. It's coming from one of the condo units. Broken pipe on private property." We exchanged uneasy glances. So it wasn't a city problem after all. It was one homeowner's problem. The city worker continued, "We've shut off the water supply to that condo for now. That should take care of the leak. Pressure should be fine in your homes again." And just like that, it was over. Or at least, that's what we thought. I went back inside, turned on my kitchen sink, and sure enough, the water pressure was strong again. Stronger than it had been in months. Relief washed over me. For a moment, I almost felt grateful. But then the realization sank in. While my problem was fixed, someone else's life had just been turned upside down. The condo they'd cut off belonged to a man none of us knew well, but we all recognized him. An older gentleman, always wheeling himself down the driveway with a small dog on his lap. He lived alone in a 2-story unit that had been retrofitted with a wheelchair lift. I later learned he was disabled, bound to that chair, and struggling with health issues most of us couldn't even imagine. And now, thanks to a busted pipe under his property, he had no water at all. The city shrugged off responsibility. They'd found the leak and done their job. But fixing it, that wasn't on them, that was on him. I remember lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about him. It didn't feel fair. The water had been flooding the road, destroying the pavement, threatening all of us. And yet, the entire burden of repair had been dropped on the shoulders of one man who clearly didn't have the means to handle it. The HOA, silent. The management company, useless. They had access to funds specifically meant for emergencies like this. But when the emergency finally came, they hid behind bureaucracy. "It's not our problem. It's private property. The board has been notified." Those words echoed in my head like a cruel joke. The next day, I walked past his condo. He was outside on his porch, slumped in his chair, a garden hose stretched awkwardly across the lawn from a neighbor's spigot, just so he could fill a few buckets. His face looked tired, defeated. I wanted to say something, to offer help, but the words stuck in my throat. What could I possibly say? "Sorry, your house is collapsing while the rest of us get to shower again." That image haunted me. And Worst part, the leak wasn't really fixed. Cutting off his water slowed it down, sure, but it didn't stop it. The ground was still wet, the swamp still there, the faint ripple of water still spreading under the road. We had just traded one problem for another. By the end of that week, neighbors were restless again. The swamp hadn't vanished. If anything, it looked angrier, murkier, darker, as if mocking us for thinking we'd escaped. Kids on skateboards skirted around it. Amazon drivers cursed under their breath as they splashed through it. And we all knew the truth. Until that broken pipe was repaired, nothing would change. But how could one disabled man afford such a massive repair? How could he even arrange for it, stuck in his chair, barely able to manage daily life? The answer was obvious. He couldn't. And yet the HOA, the very organization that should have swooped in, protected him, protected all of us, did nothing. Their silence was deafening. Their absence was unforgivable. I realized then that this wasn't just about a leak or a puddle or even a disabled man left stranded by bureaucracy. This was about power, who had it, who used it, and who suffered when it was abused. And in our neighborhood, the wrong people held the power. The first time I truly understood the weight of what was happening was when I saw him outside again, the old man in the wheelchair. His condo sat quietly at the corner, the kind of place you'd drive past without noticing, but now it had become the unwilling center of attention. The leak had been traced to his unit, his water had been cut off, and now his life was unraveling. In real time for the entire neighborhood to see, he was sitting on his porch, hunched over, fiddling with the end of that same garden hose that stretched across his yard. It connected to a spigot from his neighbor's house, like a lifeline keeping him afloat. With shaky hands, he was trying to fill a plastic jug balanced awkwardly on his lap. The sight of it nearly broke me. Here was a man who had spent decades paying dues just like the rest of us, funding the HOA reserves that were supposed to protect homeowners in times of crisis. And yet when the crisis came, he was abandoned, left to haul water like some pioneer in the 1800s. The next morning, few of us neighbors gathered at the end of the block. Nobody had called a meeting, but the frustration was boiling over. The swamp was still spreading across the street, the smell of damp asphalt clinging to the air, and there he was, still without water, still helpless. One woman finally said, "What we were all thinking, we can't just leave him like this," so we didn't. We went door to door, chipping in whatever we could. $20 here, 50 there, some even offering a few hundred. None of us were wealthy, but we all understood what it meant to face something you couldn't possibly handle on your own. Within a couple of days, we had scraped together enough money to at least get a plumber out to assess the damage. The plumber's verdict was brutal. The pipe wasn't just leaking, it was destroyed. Replacing it would cost thousands, and because it was under his unit, buried deep, it wasn't a quick job. The man in the wheelchair sat silently as the plumber explained the details, nodding. Slowly, his hands folded in his lap. I'll never forget the look in his eyes. Not anger, not even fear, but resignation. The look of someone who had fought too many battles already and didn't have the strength for one more. The HOA? Still nowhere to be found. We had called, emailed, begged them to step in, but the response was always the same. The board has been notified. Those words had become poison to me. What good was a board we couldn't see, couldn't speak? Two couldn't even identify? What kind of leadership hides behind a curtain while the very people they're supposed to protect are drowning, literally? Meanwhile, the swamp grew worse. The city had turned his water back on after pressure from some sympathetic officials, which meant the leak was active again. Water trickled beneath the street day and night, bubbling up through the pavement, feeding the stagnant pool that now stretched halfway down the block. Our neighborhood looked like a disaster zone, and every time I drove past, I felt ashamed. Ashamed that a man who could barely move without assistance was being asked to shoulder the weight of fixing something that affected us all. Ashamed that our HOA, with its thousands of dollars in reserve funds, chose to stand aside and watch. Ashamed that the only real leadership was coming from regular homeowners, pooling together spare change to try and patch a problem much bigger than any of us could handle alone. But at the same time, there was a strange kind of pride too, because for the first time I saw what real community looked like. Not the polished version you see in HOA newsletters with stock photos of smiling families, but the raw, gritty reality of neighbors stepping up when the people in power failed. I watched teenagers from down the street carry cases of bottled water up his driveway. I watched a retired couple write a check they probably couldn't afford to give. I watched neighbors I had barely spoken to before show up with food, supplies, and words of encouragement. It was messy, it was imperfect, but it was real. And through it all, the HOA remained silent. The management company didn't call back. The board never appeared. It was like they were waiting us out, hoping the problem would somehow fix itself, hoping we'd stop asking questions. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about a pipe or a puddle or even the suffering of one disabled man. This was about something bigger. It was about accountability. It was about the system that had been designed to protect us, but had been twisted into something unrecognizable. A wall of secrecy, incompetence, and neglect. And as I watched my neighbors rally around that man doing what the HOA refused to, I felt something shift inside me. Anger, yes. Frustration, absolutely. But also a spark of resolve. If the people in charge wouldn't step up, then maybe it was time for someone else to take their place. By the time a full month had passed, our street didn't look like a street anymore. It looked like a warning. The swamp was still there, the water still seeping up through the cracks, the pavement sagging under the weight of every passing car. The smell of wet asphalt hung in the air like a permanent reminder of everything that had gone wrong. But the worst part wasn't the swamp. The worst part was the silence. From the HOA board, nothing. From the management company, nothing. Even after dozens of calls, emails, and in-person visits to their office, the only response we ever got was that hollow line. The board has been notified. Not once did a board member show their face. Not once did they walk our block, look at the swamp, or speak to the disabled man whose life they had thrown into chaos. It was as if they lived in another world entirely, insulated from the very community they claimed to govern. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just incompetence. It was a design. The system was built this way, layers of management, secrecy, and privacy rules that shielded board members from accountability. We were paying into a machine that existed only to protect itself, not us. The realization made me furious, but it also made me determined. One night I found myself standing at the window again, staring at the glow of the streetlights reflecting off the swamp. Behind me, the sound of my dishwasher hummed. Water flowing smoothly again in my home, while 12 houses down a disabled neighbor still struggled to fill buckets with a garden hose. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't just watch anymore. The next morning, I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to run for the board, not because I wanted power or recognition or to be the guy who showed up at meetings with a gavel in hand. No. I wanted something much simpler. I wanted accountability. I wanted transparency. I wanted to drag the board out of the shadows and remind them that they were supposed to serve us, not hide from us. When I told a few neighbors about my decision, their reactions surprised me. Instead of skepticism, I saw relief, nods of agreement, even encouragement. "We need someone like you," one woman said, "someone who'll actually listen." The more people I spoke to, the more I realized just how broken the system was. This water leak wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the latest in a long string of neglect. Roads left unrepaired, Landscaping budgets disappearing into thin air, maintenance requests filed into a black hole. People had been living with frustration for years, but until now, nobody had dared to challenge the board. And why would they? The board had always felt untouchable, hidden behind the management company's polite but useless shields. But now, with the swamp still spreading across our road like a scar, their incompetence was visible for everyone to see. The illusion of control was gone. I started small, talking to neighbors, collecting stories, gathering support. The more I dug, the more I realized just how much power the board actually had over our lives. The money they controlled, the decisions they made in private, the authority they wielded without oversight. It was terrifying, but it was also motivating, because if the wrong people could hold that much power and do nothing with it, then maybe the right person could hold it and actually make a difference. The disabled man's situation was still dire. The neighbors were still pitching in, doing what the HOA refused to do. But out of that tragedy came something unexpected: unity. For the first time in years, we weren't just a collection of houses with picket fences and trimmed lawns. We were a community. We were fighting together, not just against a broken pipe, but against a broken system. And that, I realized, was the one thing the HOA could never control. They could ignore us, hide from us, dismiss us with rehearsed lines, but they couldn't stop us from standing together. As I filled out the paperwork to officially run for a seat on the board, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, hope, even fear. But above all, I felt resolve. I wasn't just running to fix a pipe or a swamp or a single disaster. I was running to make sure this never happened again, because one day it won't just be a puddle turning into a swamp. It'll be a roof collapsing, a sewer backing up, or a fire hydrant failing in an emergency. And if the board won't protect us when the little things go wrong, how can we trust them with the big things? That's the question that keeps me going. That's the reason I'm stepping up. And maybe, just maybe, that's how real change finally begins. And that's my story. A story about how one ignored water leak exposed just how broken our system really was. But also how neighbors standing together can be stronger than any board hiding in the shadows. If you've ever faced something like this, I'd love to hear your experience. Drop it down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe for more, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.